Winter, 1843. Hanover Street holds its breath. On the auction block stands a woman no one wanted, until a reclusive widower lifts his hand and buys her fate before the entire city. Whispers slice the cold. Charity, scandal, sin. But beneath the creak of masts and the toll of bells lies a darker current, a ledger of vanished contracts, a river that took more than a wife, and a secret poised to surface. Duty demands distance. Desire dares a single, irreversible step. Tonight begins a story of reputations undone, hearts remade, and a choice that could shatter both. Tell me where you're listening from, and what you crave most in period romances. Forbidden longing, social scandal, or hard-won redemption. Boston, Massachusetts. Winter of 1843. The air over the North End carried the scent of salt and coal smoke, and the wind from the harbor cut through wool and bone alike. On Hanover Street, where merchants shouted their wares and carts rattled over frozen cobblestones, a crowd had gathered for a different kind of trade, a debt auction. Abigail Turner stood at the center, the pale winter light glancing off her auburn hair where it escaped her bonnet in trembling curls. Her dress, of coarse grey cotton worn thin at the elbows, bore the careful mending of a woman accustomed to making do with very little. The brown wool cloak wrapped around her was frayed at the hem, its edges stiff from years of cold and damp. She kept her grey-blue eyes lowered, though she could feel them, dozens of them, staring, measuring, judging. The auctioneer's voice rose above the restless murmur, naming the sum she owed and the paltry value assigned to her labor. A bitter wind carried the whispers from one end of the crowd to the other. No family to speak for her, not a dowry to her name. Poor thing, though I suppose someone will make use of her hands. Her fingers clutched the worn fabric of her apron, knuckles white beneath the fingerless gloves. Each heartbeat seemed louder than the auctioneer's call, until a sudden hush fell, a silence heavier than the cold itself. From the far edge of the crowd, a tall figure emerged. He moved with the precision of a man who wasted nothing, not a gesture, not a word. His dark frock coat caught the pale sunlight, the sharp lines of its tailoring framing broad shoulders. Beneath the brim of a beaver felt top hat, his hazel eyes fixed on her with an unreadable intensity. Samuel Whitlock, shipbuilder, widower, wealthy enough that the creak of a coin purse could change a life. And here he was, bidding without hesitation, his deep voice carrying over the assembly. The number he spoke silenced even the most persistent gossip. The auctioneer's gavel struck the block. A ripple passed through the onlookers, astonishment, disapproval, curiosity. A man of his standing taking on a woman like her. The whispers began again, sharper now, slicing through the air like the harbor wind. He did not look at them. He looked only at her, extending a gloved hand. She hesitated, her breath clouding between them, but took it. His grip was firm, steady, pulling her from the circle of eyes into the shadow of his presence. The carriage waiting at the curb bore the discreet elegance of money, old enough to need no announcement. She sat in the corner, her cloak drawn tight, watching the city fade into the whitened edges of the harbor. The Whitlock house came into view at last, its tall windows facing the steel-blue expanse of the Atlantic. The mansion stood in solemn silence, its walls holding the weight of unspoken things. Inside, the air was warmer, but no less heavy. Mrs. Margaret Hill, the housekeeper, met them at the door with a curtsy and a glance sharp enough to measure her worth in an instant. Servants moved quietly through the halls, eyes flicking toward the newcomer before turning away. It was only as Abigail followed Mrs. Hill toward the east wing that she caught a fragment of a whisper from somewhere in the dim corridor. "The river," a voice murmured, low and certain, "took more than a wife 2 winters ago." She paused, the words curling like frost in her mind. But the house swallowed the sound, leaving only the hush of its grief-laden silence. The first morning at Whitlock House unfolded in a silence so dense it seemed woven into the very grain of the wood. The old mansion stood high above the harbor, its many windows catching the pale light of a reluctant sun. From Abigail's small chamber in the east wing, she could see the ocean's surface glazed in ice, where the tide crept between the piers. gulls circling in the distance like sentinels over the water. The air was still, yet every corner of the house seemed to hum with the memory of voices no longer heard. Her day began at the strike of the brass clock in the servants' hall. Mrs. Margaret Hill was already waiting, her dark grey dress immaculate, white apron perfectly smooth, the keys at her waist clinking softly as she walked. The housekeeper's expression was neither hostile nor welcoming, only measured, as though she were assessing whether the newcomer might hold her ground or crumble at the first gust of disapproval. "You will take your breakfast in the small parlour," Mrs. Hill said. Her tone clipped, her eyes scanning Abigail from bonnet to boots. "Mr. Whitlock prefers order. The children are to be schooled after the morning meal. They keep to their own rooms unless instructed otherwise." Abigail nodded, resisting the urge to smooth her skirt. "I understand." The corridors she was led through were wide and dim, lined with portraits in gilt frames. Faces of Whitlock's past watched her passage with stern gazes, men in naval coats, women in silks, with hands resting on the backs of ornate chairs. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and the coal fires that burned in distant hearths. The children were waiting in the parlour, seated at opposite ends of a small settee, upholstered in deep blue velvet. Clara, the elder, kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast, her long chestnut braid resting neatly over one shoulder. Henry sat with his legs swinging above the carpet, his gaze fixed on the window where frost feathered the glass. "Good morning," Abigail greeted softly, taking care not to let her voice carry the awkwardness she felt. Neither child answered. Clara's fingers tightened over the small cloth doll in her lap, its face worn from years of holding. Henry glanced at her briefly before looking away. They ate in silence. Mrs. Hill poured tea with mechanical precision, the only sound the soft clink of porcelain. Abigail noticed the children's movements, Clara's deliberate, careful, almost adult, Henry's restless but restrained, as though every gesture was practiced into quietness. After breakfast, Abigail asked Clara if she might examine the doll. At first, the girl hesitated, clutching it tighter, but finally extended it without a word. The seam at the doll's side had split, and a small wisp of wool peeked through. Abigail promised to mend it. In the schoolroom, she introduced small changes to their morning lessons. She brought a scrap of blue ribbon she had found in her sewing box and used it as a marker for Clara's reading. For Henry, she suggested they take turns stacking small logs by the hearth before returning to arithmetic, a quiet game disguised as a chore. He didn't smile, but his eyes lingered on her longer than they had that morning. As the hours passed, Abigail began to sense the house's rhythm, the quiet creak of floorboards when the wind pressed against the walls, the muffled closing of doors far down the corridor, the hushed exchanges between servants. Even laughter, when it came, was subdued, quickly swallowed by the stillness. By early afternoon, the sound of wheels on the gravel drive broke the monotony. Mrs. Hill appeared at the schoolroom door, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We have a caller," she announced. "You are to remain here." Abigail obeyed, though curiosity prickled at her. Through the tall windows, she caught a glimpse of the carriage outside, black lacquer with polished brass fittings. A liveried driver stood at attention, his gloved hands folded. Not long after, a figure swept into the house. Temperance Winthrop, widow of a shipping magnate, and a name spoken with either admiration or fear in Boston's parlors, entered as though the air itself bent to her will. Her gown was of deep plum silk, the skirts rustling like whispered disapproval. A velvet cloak trimmed in sable framed her shoulders, and her bonnet's veil cast a delicate shadow over her face, softening the sharpness of her eyes. Though Abigail could not hear every word, the tone of Mrs. Winthrop's voice carried, smooth, deliberate, edged with something that might pass for sweetness if one did not listen too closely. She asked after Mr. Whitlock's health, the children's education, the state of his shipyards. Then, after a pause, she inquired, oh, so casually, about the new governess who had arrived under unusual circumstances. Mrs. Hill's reply was polite, but guarded. "Miss Turner is settling into her duties." A soft laugh followed, brittle and lingering. "I should imagine," Mrs. Winthrop said, that settling would require patience and discretion. The words seemed to drift up the stairwell, cool as the air outside. Abigail felt them land on her like a fine dust, meant to cling. Later that day, summoned to the library to return a stack of children's books, Abigail found herself alone in Samuel Whitlock's panelled office. The scent of ink and salt-worn wood filled the space. Charts of shipping routes lay neatly rolled on the desk, alongside an inkwell and quill. As she reached to straighten one of the maps, her hand brushed against a leather-bound ledger pushed almost entirely behind a stack of nautical charts. Its placement was curious. Not carelessly misplaced, but concealed. She glanced toward the door, her breath catching in the quiet. The ledger was heavy, the pages lined in neat columns of figures and names. She recognized some as suppliers, others as rival companies. Several entries bore a notation she did not understand, letters and numbers marked in the margins, recurring beside a single name, Silas Reed. The sums beside it were large, and the dates recent. Before she could turn another page, Mrs. Hill's voice came from the doorway. "That is not for your hands, Miss Turner." Abigail closed the book at once, setting it back beneath the charts. "I was only tidying." Mrs. Hill stepped into the room, her gaze steady. "Tidying can be dangerous here. Mr. Reed's men have a way of making things disappear, including people's good names." The warning hung between them. Abigail felt the weight of it, heavier than the ledger in her hands. She nodded, offering no questions. The older woman's tone had not been unkind, but it carried the authority of someone who knew more than she would ever speak aloud. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the harbor darkened to black glass, Abigail sat by the schoolroom fire, mending Clara's doll with small, precise stitches. The children had retired early, and the house settled into its evening quiet. Somewhere in the west wing, a door closed softly, followed by the distant murmur of Samuel's voice speaking to someone unseen. Abigail's needle moved in rhythm with her thoughts. This was a house where every gesture was weighed, every word measured, where silence was not merely absence, but a language of its own. If she wished to survive here, and perhaps, in time, belong, she would have to learn to speak it. The harbor lay under a pale sky, the kind that made the sea look harder, as if the ice that clung to the edges of the wharf had seeped into the water itself. From the tall windows of the Whitlock house, Abigail could see the masts rocking in the wind, their ropes shivering like the strings of some giant unseen instrument. She had not yet set foot on the docks, but their pulse reached the house in whispers. Words carried by servants returning from errands, letters sealed with salt-stiffened parchment, and the subtle tension that crept into Mr. Whitlock's shoulders when the wind blew in from the water. The morning brought news that reached her ears almost by accident. Two footmen, thinking themselves alone in the passage outside the schoolroom, spoke in low tones about the yards. One mentioned timber that had not arrived when promised. Another, a shipbuilder refusing to renew his contract. They exchanged the name Silas Reed as if it were both an explanation and a warning. Abigail kept her eyes fixed on the copybook before her, though her ears strained to catch every word. It was not only business troubles that moved through the house like a draft. There were other murmurs, quieter but sharper in their intent. They came in half-spoken phrases, the kind that die as soon as you step into the room. Servants muttering of the winter she drowned, or the night by the wharf, and always of how Mr. Whitlock never spoke of it. Abigail began to notice small things that seemed to confirm what they did not dare say aloud. How he left the table if talk drifted to storms, how his gaze avoided the sea when the tide was high at night, how certain corridors of the house smelled faintly of salt, but remained locked. In the schoolroom the children were quieter than usual. Clara's head bent over her slate, her braid falling forward to hide her face. Henry sat at the hearth, tracing the lines in the worn bricks with the tip of his finger. Abigail felt the heaviness in their silence and decided that the morning's lessons would not be like the others. She brought from her small trunk a folded piece of thick paper on which she had drawn a large square divided into smaller ones. In each square she sketched a simple image, faces with different expressions, a warm sun, a rain cloud, a closed door, a pair of open hands. It was a picture board, something she had once seen a nursemaid use in a household where the youngest child had not spoken for nearly 2 years. "We will try something different today," she said softly, placing the board on the table between them. "You may point to whatever feels most like your day." Henry looked at it for a moment, then touched the picture of the rain cloud. Clara, after a pause, let her fingers hover over the small drawing of open hands before retreating. Abigail waited, not pressing, and returned to the lesson. It was later, when the sun had dipped behind the clouds and the light in the room turned blue, that Clara's hand returned to the board, resting, just for a moment, on the image of a small house with a lit window. Beside it, she tapped the square that showed a smiling face. Then, almost shyly, she pointed to the word Abigail had written beneath. Safe. The simplicity of the gesture struck Abigail more deeply than she could have expected. She only nodded, but inside her chest something warm stirred, like the faintest ember catching. The day drew on with its familiar order. Mr. Whitlock was in his study for much of it. The door closed, the scratch of his pen the only sign of life within. Servants moved through the halls with the muted efficiency of people who understood that discretion was as valuable as service. Once passing near the front door, Abigail caught a glimpse of him speaking to a man whose coat smelled of tar and whose hat was rimmed with frost. Their conversation was brief and ended with a curt nod. The man left with the air of someone bearing unwelcome news. That evening, after the children had been put to bed, the house seemed to draw in on itself. The wind rose outside, rattling the panes in their frames. Abigail could not sleep. She made her way down the back stairs to the kitchen, intending to warm her hands over the stove before returning to her room. She found Samuel Whitlock there, standing by the small table near the hearth, his coat removed, but his waistcoat still buttoned to the throat. A pot of coffee sat on the table, its steam curling in the lamplight. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "You are awake late," he said, his voice low, roughened by the hour. "I could not sleep," she admitted. "The wind." He gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "Sit, there is coffee, if you wish." She did, feeling the odd intimacy of the moment. The kitchen at night was a different world, stripped of the formality of the dining room, the air warmer, the shadows softer. The light from the lamp cast his face in planes of gold and shadow, deepening the lines at the corners of his eyes. For a while they sat in silence, the kind that is not empty, but watchful. He poured her a cup, the dark liquid fragrant and strong. She wrapped her hands around it, feeling the heat seep into her fingers. "I hear the docks are troubled," she ventured, choosing her words with care. His eyes lifted to hers, sharp for a moment before softening. "Troubled is one word for it. Contracts vanish. Timber meant for my ships finds its way elsewhere. Reed has a talent for making what is mine slip from my grasp." "Silas Reed," she said quietly, tasting the name. The corner of his mouth tightened. "You have been listening." "I have ears," she replied almost apologetically. He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether she might be trusted with more than she had asked. In the end, he said nothing further, only sipped his coffee and let the silence return. The wind howled against the shutters. Somewhere far off, a ship's bell rang in the darkness. She wondered if he heard it as she did, not merely as a sound, but as a memory. When she rose to leave, he stood as well, his hand brushing hers as he took her empty cup. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it lingered in her skin like a spark. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of parting that carried with it something unspoken. As she climbed the stairs back to her room, Abigail felt the weight of the house differently. Beneath its silence, there was movement. Not loud or sudden, but steady, like the slow shift of the tide. She could not yet name it, but she sensed it, and she knew it would carry her into waters deeper than she had imagined. The morning of the musical arrived shrouded in the pale, silver light that often preceded snow. Whitlock House was transformed for the occasion. Fires burned in every hearth, filling the air with the mingled scents of pine logs and polished brass. Chandeliers, their crystals catching the glow of 100 candles hung like frozen constellations above the drawing room. Servants moved in deliberate silence, carrying trays of porcelain cups, arranging chairs in neat rows, and placing fresh bouquets of hothouse roses in tall vases, roses whose perfume clung faintly to the damask curtains. Abigail had been instructed to assist discreetly, serving tea to the guests when the time came. It was a role that placed her within sight, yet firmly outside the circle of conversation. Mrs. Hill's voice that morning had been particularly measured as she explained her duties. "The Whitlocks have always maintained a standard in these gatherings. You will remember your place, Miss Turner." She did not protest. She understood the nature of her position, but she could not deny that her heart beat faster at the thought of the afternoon to come. She would see Boston society as it entered this house, people who had whispered about her in the market, perhaps even those who had stood on Hanover Street the day her fate changed. By midday, the carriages began to arrive, wheels crunching over the gravel drive, the front hall filled with the rustle of silk gowns and the low hum of voices practiced in polite restraint. Ladies removed their fur-lined cloaks, revealing bodices stitched with gold thread, gloves of the finest kid leather, and necklaces that caught the candlelight. Gentlemen stood in clusters, their frock coats cut to perfection, their cravats tied in the elaborate knots of fashion. Abigail moved quietly among them, her navy wool dress plain beside the shimmer of satins, her hair neatly pinned under a modest cap. She poured tea, the porcelain cups trembling only slightly in her hands. She kept her gaze lowered, yet the air seemed to shift when she felt Samuel Whitlock's presence nearby. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried across the room as he greeted his guests. He looked every inch the master of the house. Dark frock coat impeccably tailored, waistcoat buttoned high, the line of his jaw clean and strong. When the music began, a soft prelude from the harp in the corner, the drawing room settled into an air of genteel enjoyment. Abigail placed a cup of tea on the small table beside Temperance Winthrop, who received it with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "My dear Mr. Whitlock," Temperance said, her tone as sweet as candied violets, though every word dripped with calculated intent. "How commendable of you to extend your generosity beyond the shipyards. Taking in the unpresentable is an act of true Christian charity." The conversation at the nearby chairs paused, the surrounding ladies glancing over the rims of their teacups. The laughter that followed was light, musical, and cold as the wind that swept in from the harbor. Abigail felt the heat rise in her cheeks, though her posture remained steady. She set the teapot down with care, her hands steady despite the prickle in her chest. It was then that Samuel's voice cut through the murmur, not loud, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Mrs. Winthrop," he said evenly, "you mistake my intentions. Miss Turner is here because she is capable, reliable, and trusted in my home. I hope that is understood." The air in the room shifted. Temperance's smile thinned, her eyes narrowing just slightly, but she inclined her head in acquiescence. The moment passed, but its echo remained in Abigail's heartbeat. She did not look at him, yet she felt the silent shield he had placed between her and the world. The musicale continued, the harp giving way to a young soprano whose voice floated like frost-laced air. Abigail moved through her duties with quiet precision, yet the earlier exchange lingered in her mind. That Samuel had spoken so plainly before his peers was no small thing in a city where appearances were currency. It was as the guests were dispersing, cloaks once more wrapped against the cold, that the first tremor of urgency reached the house. A messenger, cheeks red from the wind, entered the hall with a folded note for Mr. Whitlock. Samuel read it without a word, but the sudden tightening of his jaw told the story. "A derrick cable at the South Yard has been severed, Mrs." Hill whispered to Abigail moments later, her face pale beneath her cap. "A man is injured. This has Reed's hand in it. Mark my words." Abigail's breath caught. The name carried with it all the unspoken tensions of recent weeks. She knew enough now to understand that this was more than an accident. It was a strike meant to wound both business and pride. When the last guest had gone, and the house returned to its quieter state, Samuel disappeared into his study. Abigail, her duties concluded, felt the pull of something unresolved. She climbed the narrow servant's stair to the upper corridor, then slipped into the office when she was certain she was alone. The ledger was where she had first seen it, half concealed behind the rolled nautical charts. Her fingers hesitated only a moment before opening it. The columns of figures were neat, almost beautiful in their precision. But the patterns began to reveal themselves the longer she looked. Names of suppliers crossed out, replaced with new ones she did not recognize. Dates that matched the delays she had overheard the footman discussing. And there again, Silas Reed, written in a sharper hand, as if pressed harder into the page, the ink darker where the quill had paused. She took from her pocket the small scraps of paper she used for the children's lesson notes and began to copy down the details. Dates, amounts, the curious notations she did not yet understand. She worked quickly, the scratch of the quill loud in her ears, every creak of the house making her heart leap. When she returned the ledger to its hiding place, she pressed the folded scraps deep into the lining of her apron. Whatever Reed's dealings were, she would not remain ignorant of them. She had no illusions about her place in this house or in the world beyond its walls. But knowledge was a kind of armor, and she would gather every piece she could. Later, as night settled over the harbor and the house grew still, Abigail stood by the window in her small room, looking out at the faint lights that marked the distant piers. Somewhere out there, men worked in the cold, repairing what had been broken. Somewhere, Reed was calculating his next move, and somewhere within this same house, Samuel Whitlock bore the weight of every decision, both for his shipyards and for those under his roof. She could not yet see the path ahead, but she felt the tide shifting, pulling her toward a place where silence would no longer serve her. In the hush of the winter night, she resolved that she would not be merely a witness to the storms gathering over Whitlock House. She would be ready when they broke. The storm began before dawn, a low moan from the harbor that rose into a howl by mid-morning. By noon, the wind was a living thing, pressing its cold breath against every window of Whitlock House, rattling shutters and driving snow into the seams of the great double doors. The world beyond the walls had vanished, swallowed by a white that blurred sky and earth alike. Inside, the house held its breath. Fires burned in every grate, yet the air seemed to carry the restless energy of the blizzard. In the library, the largest hearth roared, flames licking the black iron grate, sending waves of heat into the high-ceilinged room. Abigail had chosen this space for the afternoon, knowing the children would feel safer here than in their separate rooms, listening to the wind scrape at the eaves. She laid thick quilts and pillows on the carpet, fashioning them into a small fort near the fire. Chairs were drawn close, a wool blanket draped across their backs to form a roof. Henry watched from the edge of the hearth, his eyes bright with the curiosity he tried to hide. Clara stood further back, her doll clasped to her chest, as if uncertain whether this was truly for her. "You may come inside," Abigail told them gently, smoothing a quilt where it sagged. "It will be warmer than any bed tonight." Henry stepped forward first, crawling into the space she had made, his small boots leaving prints on the fabric. Clara hesitated longer, but when Abigail lifted the blanket flap and smiled at her, she slipped inside without a word, sitting close to her brother. Abigail settled cross-legged on the floor beside the fort, her skirts spilling around her in a circle of dark wool. She reached for a small carved ship from the library's mantel, a toy she had found earlier that day, and placed it before them. "Once," she began, her voice low and steady, "there was a captain who sailed from this very harbor on a winter morning like this one. The ice was thick on the pilings, and the gulls circled low, as if they knew the ship's journey would be a hard one." Her words wove through the warm air, painting pictures of storm-tossed waves, lanterns swaying in the dark, and the moment when the ship found safe harbor again. She described the creak of timbers, the scent of salt spray, the courage it took to keep the wheel steady when the sky itself seemed to tilt. Henry's gaze never left her face. At some point, he reached behind him and pulled from his pocket a small wooden ship. Its paint worn, its mast slightly crooked. Without a word, he leaned forward and placed it in her lap. Abigail paused, touched by the gesture. She met his eyes and gave a small nod, closing her fingers over the ship. The room seemed to hold a different warmth then, one not born of fire, but of something far more fragile. The blizzard deepened, snow slanting across the tall library windows in ghostly sheets. Abigail told another story, softer now, of a lighthouse keeper who tended his light every night, no matter how fierce the storm, so that sailors would find their way home. She did not notice at first the way Clara's posture had changed, how she leaned slightly forward, her lips parted as if tasting the shape of a word she had not spoken in years. When the silence came between sentences, Clara's voice, thin and trembling, broke it. "Stay." The word was so small, so frail, that for a heartbeat, Abigail thought it might have been the wind in the chimney. But the look in Clara's greenish hazel eyes, wide, uncertain, pleading, banished all doubt. Abigail's throat tightened. She could not move quickly, not to frighten her, but she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand lightly over the child's. "I will," she said, her voice no more than a whisper. Henry glanced at his sister, his brows drawn, but did not speak. The fire popped in the grate, casting a warm light over their faces. Abigail felt her vision blur, but she blinked back the tears before they could fall. A governess should not cry in front of her charges, yet the weight of that single word, after so much silence, pressed on her heart with the force of a tidal wave. It was in that moment she sensed she was not alone. A shift in the air made her glance toward the doorway. Samuel Whitlock stood there, one hand braced against the frame. The light from the hallway haloed his shoulders, but his face was shadowed, save for the eyes that fixed on the scene before him. Something in his expression was unguarded, as if the layers of reserve he wore so easily had been loosened. His gaze moved from the children to Abigail, lingering for a moment too long. Abigail rose slowly, her skirts whispering over the carpet. She stepped toward the mantel to set down the wooden ship Henry had given her. Samuel moved almost at the same moment, and for an instant their hands were close enough to touch. The distance between them was no more than the width of the hearth, yet it felt charged, every inch heavy with unspoken words. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes held hers, searching, perhaps questioning, before he turned slightly away, his hand brushing the edge of the mantel instead. The moment broke, but the air between them still hummed with something fragile and unformed. Samuel murmured a quiet goodnight to the children, his voice softer than she had yet heard it, and stepped back into the hallway. The storm raged long into the evening. After the children had been coaxed into bed beneath heavy quilts, Abigail lingered in the library to tidy away the pillows and blankets. She found herself smoothing the fabric more than was necessary, her thoughts turning over the look she had seen in Samuel's face. It was near midnight when a knock at her door startled her. Mrs. Hill stood in the corridor, a letter in her hand. "This came with the evening post," she said, her expression unreadable. Abigail took it, the paper cold against her fingers. The handwriting on the front made her stomach tighten. It was a hand she had hoped never to see again. Inside, the words were brief, but each carried the weight of years she had tried to leave behind. Ezra Pike, the man who had once held her future in the crook of his arm, and then closed his hand until she could not breathe. He was in Boston. He wanted a conversation about debts, about what she owed, and one more thing, a line that made her blood run cold. "I understand you are in the company of Mr. Whitlock. We should discuss Mr. Reed." The blizzard battered the house, but the chill that gripped her then had nothing to do with the snow. She folded the letter with care, tucking it deep into the small wooden box on her bedside table, as if the act might keep its contents from leaking into the air. Lying awake, listening to the wind scrape against the glass, Abigail knew that the peace of this day, the fragile spark in Clara's voice, the quiet ember in Samuel's gaze, was already shadowed by the storm that would follow. But for tonight, she clung to the memory of that single word and the warmth it had lit in her heart. The snow that had blanketed the city for days had begun to melt, leaving the streets slick with slush and the harbor shrouded in a damp, metallic chill. Whitlock House, however, stood as it always did, stern and dignified against the elements, its windows reflecting the pale light of an unforgiving season. Yet within those walls, the air had shifted. Whispers had begun to cling like frost to the corners of rooms, drifting from mouth to mouth with the stealth of something dangerous. It began with the broadsides. They appeared first at the docks, cheap handbills tacked to posts and warehouse doors, the ink still fresh enough to stain the fingers of those who read them. They did not name Samuel Whitlock outright, but the insinuation was unmistakable. Words printed in bold strokes: a respected wife lost to the sea, a quarrel heard by many, an accident, or something darker. By the time one of the harbour boys smuggled a copy into the kitchen, the servants had already heard. They whispered over the breadboard, voices low but urgent. Mrs. Hill confiscated the sheet before Abigail could read more than a handful of sentences, her expression set in granite. "Some people," the housekeeper said sharply, "would rather feed lies than bread to a man's children. And you will not repeat a word of it to the young ones, Miss Turner." But the damage was done. Even without seeing the full text, Abigail could sense the undercurrent it carried. The house itself seemed to stiffen, as though the walls braced against an invisible assault. That evening, an unsigned note was slid under the door of the schoolroom. Abigail recognized the same cheap paper and hurried, messy hand. It claimed to come from someone who knew the truth about the night of the drowning. It spoke of a quarrel on the wharf, of voices raised in anger, of a woman boarding a small boat in defiance. No proof, no signature, only poison meant to seep into the cracks of the Whitlock name. She tucked the note away, unsure whether to show it to Samuel. The unease it brought did not fade, and by the following morning, unease had become something far more dangerous. She returned to her room after the children's lessons to find her small writing desk disturbed. The top drawer, which she always kept locked, hung slightly open. Inside, among her modest possessions, lay a pair of pearl drop earrings she had never seen before, and a sealed note addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand. Her first thought was disbelief. Her second, a sharp rush of fear. The earrings were expensive, too fine for a governess, too fine for a woman with her history. The note, when opened, held only a few lines written in a jagged scrawl, a gift for services rendered. "Say nothing, or more will be said for you." She stared at the words until they blurred. Whoever had placed them there knew what such a discovery could mean in a house like this, how quickly suspicion could take root. Her mind raced through possibilities, but only one name settled in her thoughts with any certainty: Silas Reed. A knock at the door broke her stillness. Mrs. Hill entered, her sharp eyes sweeping the room. They fell almost instantly on the earrings, and Abigail braced herself for accusation. Instead, the older woman crossed the space between them and lifted the pearls with careful fingers, turning them in the light. "These," Mrs. Hill said quietly, "have not been here long, and they did not arrive honestly." Abigail's breath caught. "You believe me?" "I believe in the skill of certain men to ruin others without touching them," the housekeeper replied. "And I believe Reed has tried to walk these halls before, though never by the front door." Together, they concealed the earrings and the note, tucking them into Mrs. Hill's own locked drawer. "For now," the housekeeper warned, "say nothing. Let them wonder why their trap has not sprung." That night, with the children tucked in and the house settling into its nocturnal silence, Abigail sought Samuel in the library. He sat in a leather armchair near the fire, his face shadowed but alert. She did not speak of the planted jewelry or the note. Some instinct told her that revealing it now would only muddy what trust she had earned. Instead, she told him fragments of her own truth. She spoke of the workhouse where she had spent her youth, of the endless mending and scrubbing, of learning to stretch bread dough so thin it might feed twice as many mouths. She told him of her vow, made quietly to herself on a night of hunger, that she would never again sell her dignity for a roof or a meal. He listened without interruption, his eyes steady on hers. When she finished, he only nodded once, as though filing away a fact that might matter later. She kept Ezra Pike's letter locked in her box, its contents pressing against her thoughts like a bruise she dared not touch. She could not tell Samuel of it, not when Clara had spoken her first word in years, not when Henry had begun to smile in fleeting moments. The shadow Ezra cast was her burden alone to carry. In the days that followed, she threw herself into quiet investigation. In stolen moments, she compared the details she had copied from Samuel's ledger with gossip overheard among dock workers and merchants' clerks. Patterns emerged. Suppliers whose goods vanished in transit, contracts that dissolved after whispered warnings, manifests altered in subtle but ruinous ways. All led back, in threads fine as cobwebs, to Reed. It was during one of these forays into the lower docks, cloaked and hooded against the wind, that a dockhand she vaguely recognized approached her. His coat smelled of fish and tar, and his eyes darted constantly over her shoulder. "You work for Whitlock," he said, more statement than question. "I do," she replied cautiously. He leaned closer, lowering his voice until she could barely catch the words. "You want to know about Reed? His men meet in the rope walk, near the West Pier, after midnight. That's where you'll hear what really happened the night the lady died." Abigail felt her pulse quicken. "You mean—" "I mean they talk when the work's done and the rum's open. One of them saw it, the drowning. And he's not the only one." Before she could press him for more, he melted into the tangle of men hauling crates and coiling ropes, leaving her with the icy weight of his words. That evening, back at Whitlock House, she watched Samuel at dinner. His composed posture, the deliberate way he cut his meat, the polite inquiries he made after the children's lessons. He carried himself as though nothing could touch him, yet she could see the tension in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes when the conversation strayed near the harbour. She wondered what truth the rope walk might hold, and whether she could reach it without pulling the whole fragile fabric of the household into shreds. But one thing was certain. The storm that had begun with whispers was gathering force, and sooner or later it would break. The air that morning was brittle, the kind that made breath turn to frost before it could rise. Snow from the previous night's flurries clung stubbornly to the edges of the cobblestones and to the black iron fence that surrounded Whitlock House. Abigail had stepped out to the back gate to take in a moment of quiet before returning to the schoolroom. The cold had sharpened the scent of the sea. The tide was out, and the gulls cried faintly over the distant masts. She did not hear him approach. "Still keeping to fine company, I see." The voice came from her left, low and smooth, with an edge of mockery she knew too well. Ezra Pike leaned against the gatepost, his coat collar turned up against the cold, his hat shadowing the narrowness of his face. The years had deepened the cunning in his eyes, and there was a slackness to his mouth that spoke of indulgence and debts unpaid. Abigail's fingers curled into the folds of her skirt. "You have no business here." Oh, I have business, Abigail," he replied, stepping closer. "Business that concerns both of us. You've done well for yourself, haven't you? Living under Whitlock's roof, teaching his children. Let's not pretend your past is spotless. You and I both know the truth would make his precious society turn on you like dogs." She held his gaze, willing her voice to remain steady. "If you came for money, you'll leave disappointed." His smile widened without warmth. "Money, yes. Enough to make certain my memory stays selective. And while we're speaking plainly, you should know, Reed and I have spoken. He has a particular interest in your employer, and in how easily his household might be unsettled." The name landed between them like a blow. Abigail's breath caught in her throat, but she gave no sign of fear. "You've tied yourself to the wrong man, Ezra." "Maybe," he said, shrugging, "but wrong men tend to pay well when they want something badly enough." Before she could answer, the crunch of footsteps on the snow made them both turn. Samuel Whitlock stood at the far end of the path, his posture rigid, his eyes flicking from Ezra to her. Ezra straightened his coat, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Mr. Whitlock," he said smoothly, before walking away, his boots leaving crooked prints in the frost. Samuel's expression was unreadable as he reached her. "Who was that man?" "No one of consequence," she said quickly. "That is not the truth," he replied, his voice tight. "I saw the way he spoke to you." She tried again. "He is from my past. Your past," he interrupted, the words hardening. "A past you have avoided speaking of. And now he is at my gate, making a scene that could be witnessed by any passerby." The silence between them was thick as the grey clouds above. She searched his face for some sign of trust, but found only the guarded severity he wore when discussing the safety of his children. "Mr. Whitlock, I cannot risk it," he said finally. "Not now, not with the children just beginning to breathe again." His voice faltered on the last words, but his decision was already set. "You will leave. I'll see you settled in a boarding house for a month, with wages for your service." Her hands went cold inside her gloves. "You mean to send me away without hearing?" "This is not punishment," he said, though the finality in his tone made it so. "It is necessity." And with that, the world she had built inside these walls, fragile and new, began to collapse. 2 days later, Abigail walked out of Whitlock House with a single trunk and the weight of a dozen unanswered questions pressing against her chest. The boarding house was on the edge of the North End, where the scent of the sea mingled with the acrid smoke of the mills. The room was small, its single window rimed with frost, its bed sagging in the middle. Work was found quickly. Boston's mills always had need of hands willing to endure their air, heavy with lint that clung to skin and hair. Days became a blur of clattering machines, spinning bobbins, and the rasp of her own breath in the dust. Her fingers blistered and cracked. The coarse wool of her dress grew rougher with each shift. At night, she lay in the narrow bed listening to the clamor of the street below, cartwheels, drunken laughter, the cry of a baby somewhere in the building. The quiet she had once known at Whitlock House seemed impossibly distant. Back in that house, the absence was felt. Mrs. Hill, with her sharp eyes and sharper instincts, noticed the change almost immediately. Clara returned to her silence, answering questions with a nod or a shake of the head. Henry woke in the night crying for reasons he could not name, his small hands clutching at the covers as though they might anchor him. Mrs. Hill began her own quiet work. She asked the footman about the stranger at the gate, the one who had spoken to Miss Turner. She traced the errand boy's route and learned that a man matching Ezra Pike's description had been seen near the rope walk more than once, speaking to one of Reed's known messengers. One afternoon, under the pretense of delivering a letter, Mrs. Hill followed that same messenger from the market to a tavern by the wharf. She watched from across the street as he handed a sealed packet to Ezra Pike, who slipped it inside his coat without looking around. The coins exchanged afterward were quick and discreet, but not discreet enough to escape her notice. When she returned to the house, she said nothing to Samuel, yet she knew the value of timing, and she would choose her moment carefully. Meanwhile, the halls of Whitlock House grew quieter, the fires seeming to burn lower, as though the warmth Abigail had brought with her had been carried out in her trunk. Samuel walked the corridors with a heavier tread, his mind fixed on business, though more than once his gaze lingered on the east wing, where the schoolroom door remained closed. Winter pressed on, its cold sinking into stone and bone alike. And though Abigail now lived among the clamor of the mills, she felt the same chill, knowing that what she had lost was not merely a position, but a place in a world that had begun to feel like home. The nor'easter arrived at dusk, like a furious guest who had been kept waiting. Wind came first, hurling itself against the city with the deep, relentless roar of a great beast. Then sheets of rain, twisted sideways, needled with sleet that slapped at shutters and scoured the streets clean of footsteps in a matter of breaths. The harbour vanished behind a veil of storm. Lantern lights smudged across rain-lashed panes and became trembling moons, reflected on puddles that raced along the cobbles and poured with a hiss into the black throat of the sea. Abigail walked with her head bowed beneath a borrowed hooded cloak, the coarse wool plastered to her shoulders. The mill's shift had bled her of warmth and air alike, lint gritting in her throat, hands raw where the weave had bitten. She had left the boarding house with one thought only, to cross the wharf fast enough to keep the wet from finding its way through every seam of her shoes. But the storm had other designs. It pressed her toward the waterfront with a hand at her back, as if the whole world tilted to send her there. The rope walk stretched long and narrow beside the yards, a low spine of tarred boards and shuttered windows. In quieter weather, men would stride its length to twist strands into lines strong enough to bind sails to masts and fortunes to ships. Tonight, it hunched against the gale, a dark silhouette wrung by wind. Abigail kept to the lee of a warehouse, blinking against the sting of rain, when a light flared at the rope walk's far end, first a flicker, then a tongue, then a terrible bloom that licked upward with sudden hunger. Fire, bright as a torn banner against the storm. Abigail froze. For a heartbeat, the wind seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the flame found air and rope, tar and dry sawdust. It leapt with feral joy, running along the building's belly in quick, devouring strides. Someone shouted. Another voice answered, snatched thin by the gale. A bell began to ring, frantic and uneven. She moved before she had finished the thought, skirts heavy with rain, boots thudding over boards slick as eel skin. The smoke came low, a crawling creature bitter with pitch. It found her mouth and eyes and burned its way in. She pulled the edge of her cloak across her nose and pushed forward. Men spilled from the yard, sheds like startled birds, faces shining with water and firelight. Buckets flew hand to hand, a shuddering chain in which each link was a body leaning toward heat and away from death. Another bell answered the first, then another, until the clamor became a wild music, metal against night, warning against wind. Back there, a voice bellowed. The hooks! Get the hooks! Abigail reached the rope walk's side and stared into the unsteady furnace. Through wavering smoke she glimpsed figures, shadows jerking, arms thrown up, the heave of shoulders. Then thin as a reed and sharp as a knife, a cry threaded the din. A child's cry, small, terrified, familiar. Her heart slammed. Henry. It made no sense, and all the sense in the world. She saw at once the shape of a memory, a small wooden ship, left in a pocket of the office, a boy who measured safety by the touch of a toy. In a house where rooms held more silence than speech, a child might slip into the night to reclaim the only thing that had ever felt like a promise. "Henry!" she shouted, and the storm took his name and threw it back to her in tatters. There was no time to think. She ducked beneath a sagging lintel and went inside, heat striking her skin like a slap. Fire ran along ceiling beams as if the building had grown veins of flame. Smoke rolled and rolled, the floorboards popping beneath her feet. She moved low, the cloak dragged over her mouth, eyes streaming, one palm skimming the wall to anchor her when the world tilted. "Henry!" she said again, quieter, as if the building itself might carry the word forward. A small cough answered, ragged and frightened. "Stay where you are," she called, voice steadying though her lungs clawed for air. "I am coming." She found him crouched behind a barrel, his cheeks streaked with ash and tears, one hand clamped around the little ship. He looked smaller than he had any right to look, all bone and courage. "Up," she murmured, hauling him to his feet. "Arms around me. Now." He clung like a limpet, thin arms tight at her neck. Abigail staggered under his weight, and the drag of soaked wool, blinded one instant by smoke, and the next by a savage gust, when an opening yawned and slammed shut again. Something cracked above. She did not look up. She moved. They reached the doorway as a tongue of flame unfurled across their path. Heat blistered the air. Henry flinched and pressed his face into her shoulder. Abigail gathered what breath remained and lunged, the fire's edge kissing her cloak. They burst into rain, stumbling hard onto the deck outside, coughing until spots danced before her eyes. Hands reached for the boy, yard men with soot-masked faces and urgent, careful fingers. Henry's grip loosened only when he saw Abigail's eyes on him and felt her nod, slow and sure. Someone wrapped him in a blanket and carried him toward the sound of the closest bell. Abigail swayed once and steadied herself against the wall. The rain lashed, the fire answered with a sullen roar, and over it, as if the storm itself had spoken, she heard a voice that cleaved the night. "Miss Turner!" Samuel. He came out of the smoke like a figure pulled from a fever dream, coat abandoned, shirt sleeves drenched and streaked with soot. eyes bright as if the fire's heart burned inside them. He reached for her shoulders with hands that shook and then stilled the moment they closed around her. "Henry," he said, not a question. "Alive," she managed. A sound left him that was almost a laugh and almost a prayer. He looked into her face as if he meant to memorize it, rain carving paths through ash on his cheeks. The intimacy of his relief flashed between them, more searing than heat, and then the rope walk groaned. Inside, 2 men are trapped, someone shouted. "The end section, brace it or we lose the lot." Samuel turned. Duty snapped into place over the rawness of fear. He moved toward the failing doorway, and Abigail knew with a clarity sharp enough to wound that if he disappeared into that mouth, she would follow. "Not alone," she said. He glanced back, a protest open on his lips, but she was already beside him. The rear section coughed out fire like a foundry. A beam had fallen and pinned another at a crooked angle. A makeshift gallows that would swing free with a little persuasion and crush everything beneath it. 2 men huddled beyond, half hidden by smoke, their eyes wild. "Ropes," Samuel said. "Wet them," Abigail answered at the same instant. They worked without speaking. Mrs. Hill appeared out of the storm like judgment and grace, hair escaping her cap, shawl black with rain. She had a line of men behind her, each with a coil of rope slung over a shoulder, and a face set in that stony determination a housekeeper wears when the house itself is at stake. "Haul them through the rain trough," she ordered. "Soak them until they weep." They fed the lines through the rush of water that cascaded off the roof's edge, then threw them over the teetering beam. Hands closed, set, heaved. The soaked ropes bit into palms and left no splinters. Abigail took her place in the chain, the fibers grinding against her skin with each pull. Samuel braced beside her, shoulder to shoulder now, breath harsh, strength leashed into steadiness. Their bodies moved in a common rhythm, draw, hold, yield, draw, until the beam lifted a hand's breadth and then 2. "Again," Mrs. Hill said, voice even as a prayer. A final heave, a cry, and the crooked weight rose enough to let the trapped men crawl like newborn creatures toward air. Samuel let the rope pay out in inches, guiding the beam to a safer seat. It settled with a resentful thud. The rope walk exhaled. "Go!" he urged the men. They staggered past, coughing, one clutching a burned forearm, the other carrying a bundle he refused to release. As he lurched by, something dark fell from his pocket and skittered across the slick plank. Abigail stooped on instinct, fingers closing over a scorched scrap of paper, edges curled, ink blackened but not erased. She had seen that hand before. The crisp, angular figures, the margin notes like barbs, ledger script, read. Rain smeared the ash until the words began to bleed. She tucked the scrap into the lining of her cloak and lifted her head. Samuel stood with hands braced on his thighs, catching breath, water coursing from his hairline to his jaw. He looked at her then with a gratitude so pure it stripped everything else away. "Henry?" she said again, because there was too much in her chest for any other word. He nodded once, as if to anchor himself to sanity with that single certainty. Then his gaze slid past her and hardened. Flames flared along the roofline where sparks had found new meal. The bucket line jerked and bucked. Men shouted, stumbling in the wind. A constable's rattle skittered somewhere out of sight. A woman from the nearest tenement screamed and clapped both hands over her mouth. "Mrs." Hill touched Abigail's elbow with an uncharacteristically gentle hand. "You are coming with me," she said. "There's no use for you in the line if your lungs give out." "I am well enough," Abigail began, but the older woman's look, granite wreathed in steam, tolerated no argument. "Take that to heart," Mrs. Hill added in a lower tone, eyes flicking to the hidden bulge where the scorched scrap warmed against Abigail's ribs. "And keep it dry." They moved toward the warehouse eaves, where the rain fell kinder and the wind could not reach as fiercely. Witnesses gathered in the edges of the storm, the circle widening with every shout and bell. Yardmen stood dark and tall as pilings. Apprentices leaned forward until masters dragged them back by their collars. 2 aldermen hunched beneath an umbrella, that turned inside out, faces revealed and quickly hidden again. The baker from the corner clutched his hat to his head. Whitlock's foreman barked orders that ricocheted like hurled stones. Rumors already prickled and ran. Arson, sabotage, Reed's name hissing like steam. Through it all, the storm raged. Firefighters wrestled a hand engine into place. The pump wheezed, then caught, and a thin arc of water leapt against the orange hide of the building. The smell changed, less sweet, more bitter, when soaked hemp smouldered. Abigail coughed into the crook of her elbow until the fit passed. Beside her, Mrs. Hill's breath came short but even, as if she had decided it would. "Look," the housekeeper said, chin tipping toward the edge of the crowd. Abigail followed her gaze. A knot of men stood aloof from the labor and the fear, hats brim low against the rain, attention too carefully elsewhere. She recognized one, Reed's messenger, the man Mrs. Hill had tracked with silent steps and ice-cold eyes. He shifted, and for an instant his coat flapped open. The sharp corner of a ledger leaf showed at his pocket's mouth, twin to the scorched scrap against Abigail's heart. "Noted," Mrs. Hill murmured, as if adding a sum in her head. "Let him think he is unseen." A movement to their right drew Abigail's eye. Henry, blanket bundled around him like a small brown sail, was perched on a crate beneath the shelter of a doorway. His eyes were enormous in his smudged face, but when he saw her, he lifted the wooden ship and held it, not as a toy, but as a standard. She felt the world tilt and right itself. She pressed a hand to the doorframe to steady the sudden ache. Samuel crossed to the boy and crouched. The storm's soundtrack softened for an instant, like a stage curtain muffling an orchestra. Father and son touched foreheads, the gesture so simple it scalded. Henry's lips moved. Abigail could not hear the words, yet she felt them land inside her as surely as if she had spoken them herself. Around them, order asserted itself inch by inch. Fire shrank under the steady insistence of water and rain. Smouldering lines were cut and cast into puddles where they hissed like snakes. The ropewalk, wounded but standing, shivered as wind found new cracks to gnaw. A constable took names with a pencil gone blunt. The foreman counted men, counted again. Someone pressed a flask into Mrs. Hill's hands. She took a small medicinal sip and passed it to Abigail, who let the heat burn a narrow path to her lungs. When she straightened, Samuel was there, rain striped across his cheekbones, eyes steadied to something like calm. "You should be in a warm room," he said, but the roughness in his voice confessed he wanted her no farther than arm's length. "I will go when Henry sleeps," she answered, "and when the worst is past." They did not touch. They did not need to. The nearness was its own heat, held between them like a lamp carefully shaded from wind. A shout rose from the pump line. The rear wall gave a protesting sigh and folded inward, sending up a gout of ember spark that the rain smothered to sullen glow. The worst at last had the grace to be over. Only then, when the storm's tantrum ground down to raw endurance, did Abigail ease a hand to the seam of her cloak and draw out the scorched scrap. She shielded it with her palm and the sheltering curve of her body. Ink bled, but not enough to obliterate the hand that had written it. A column of figures, a supplier's name she had copied once before in a hurried script, and in the margin, a notation like a brand, initials shaped with a flourish she had come to recognize in the quiet of a paneled office. She looked to Mrs. Hill, who answered her question with the barest nod. "Proof," the housekeeper said, her voice a ribbon of iron. Not a prophecy, not a promise, only a fact, warmed by the beating heart that carried it. The storm could claw, and the fire could roar, men could lie, and others could be bought. Faneuil Hall loomed against the pewter sky like a fortress of commerce and judgment, its brick walls glistening faintly with the morning sleet. Inside, the great chamber swelled with the rustle of wool coats and the murmur of impatient voices, the polished floorboards carrying the echo of boots and the sharper click of ladies' heels. Lanterns had been lit despite the hour. Their light cast a molten glow across the carved panels and gilded edges of the alderman's dais. The air smelled of wet wool, ink, and the faint tang of salt that followed every man from the harbour. Abigail sat near the back, flanked by Mrs. Hill on one side and Clara on the other. Henry pressed close beside his sister. She could feel the rhythm of the girl's breathing, quickened not by fear alone, but by the weight of the place, its gravity pressing on her small shoulders. It was the same pressure that set Abigail's own pulse to an irregular beat. She kept her hands clasped in her lap, the damp warmth of her gloves a thin armor against the glances darting her way. At the far end of the chamber, Samuel stood among the merchants, tall and uncompromising, his broad shoulders squared beneath a dark coat. His face was set in lines that spoke of long battles fought without quarter. If he looked toward Abigail, he gave no sign, but she felt the thread that stretched between them, taut and unbroken, like a mooring line in a gale. The alderman presiding struck the table with a mallet, calling the hall to order. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried over the assembly as he named the matter at hand: the fire at the rope walk, the sabotage of the Whitlock yards, and the malicious rumors surrounding the death of Mrs. Eliza Whitlock. Every name spoken sent a subtle ripple through the crowd, a shifting of weight, a tightening of jaws. Temperance Winthrop arrived late enough to be noticed, her entrance deliberate. She swept into the chamber draped in dove-grey silk, her veil lifted to reveal eyes alight with a satisfaction she made no attempt to hide. Her gaze lingered on Abigail with the cool precision of a scalpel, then drifted to Samuel, searching for cracks. She found none and smiled as if she had. Silas Reed sat a few rows ahead, immaculately turned out in a black frock coat, his cravat pinned with a discreet pearl. He leaned toward an associate and murmured something that drew a thin smile. His posture was one of a man confident in his footing, even in a hall filled with those eager to see him stumble. Ezra Pike lurked near the side wall, hat in hand, the damp from his coat hem leaving a dark crescent on the polished floor. His expression was the practiced mask of a man ready to lie if the price was right. Abigail's stomach tightened, the memory of his voice at the boarding house door surfacing like a stone through shallow water. The first witness was called, a housemaid from Whitlock House, her hands worrying the folds of her apron. Mrs. Hill had brought her forward with the quiet certainty of someone setting a key into the correct lock. The girl testified to seeing Reed's runner in the corridor outside Abigail's room, the night before the trinkets and sealed note had been found. Her voice wavered, but the alderman leaned forward, the room leaning with him. Mrs. Hill followed, her testimony crisp, unadorned, and lethal in its precision. She laid the trinkets on the alderman's table, their surfaces catching the lamplight. Each piece bore the faint smudge of tampering, a clasp bent, a seal subtly marred. She recounted the moment she noticed the irregularities and the trail that led her to Reed's messenger. The crowd murmured. Even among merchants accustomed to ruthless competition, such planting of evidence was a foulness that left a sour taste. The dockhand was next, a broad-shouldered man with wind-burned skin. He spoke of late-night meetings in the rope walk, of coin-changing hands, of orders whispered and written in a ledger he had glimpsed, ink as black as the tar that stained his nails. Abigail's breath caught at the mention. She knew that Ledger had copied its entries in the lamplight of Samuel's office. Mrs. Hill's hand rested briefly over hers, a silent affirmation that the threads were knitting together at last. Reed rose to respond, his voice smooth, each denial measured as if the truth could be coaxed into submission by the weight of his composure. He disavowed the runner, dismissed the ledger as fabrication, suggested that the fire was the result of negligence among Samuel's men. His words were like oiled silk, and for a moment the room's attention seemed to sway toward him. Then Samuel stepped forward. His voice was steady, carrying the timbre of the shipyards, of orders given over the clamor of labor. He addressed the alderman directly, but his gaze found Ezra Pike. "You have something to say, I believe. Say it now, before these men, before the city." Ezra's smirk wavered. "I have no—" "You do," Samuel cut in, his tone iron. "And you will say it here." Silence closed in. Ezra's eyes darted to Reed, then back. The room felt the shift, the moment when a man stands on the edge between loyalty and ruin. "He paid me," Ezra said at last, his voice barely above a mutter. "Reed paid me to spread the tales, about her past, about theft, and to put those things in her room." The murmur that followed was a tide breaking against stone. Reed's composure fractured, just enough for those watching to see. The presiding alderman's gaze hardened. "And the matter of Mrs. Whitlock's death?" It was Samuel who answered, his words slow, deliberate. "That night there was no quarrel. My wife was grieving her father and determined to take his ashes to the sea, despite the storm. I begged her to wait. She would not. I went with her to the wharf, hoping to stop her. The wind caught her as she stepped into the boat. She slipped. I went in after her." His voice caught, the crack subtle but sharp. "I did not reach her in time." The room held its breath. Reed's gossip, the poisonous insinuations, dissolved under the weight of the truth spoken without ornament. From beside Abigail, a small hand slipped into hers. She looked down to find Clara, pale but steady, her eyes fixed not on the alderman, but on the assembly at large. When she spoke, her voice was clear and sure, carrying farther than seemed possible. "She saved us," Clara said. "She is our family." The hall hushed, the kind of hush that presses into the skin. Merchants who had looked on Abigail with suspicion now shifted, some with discomfort, others with reluctant respect. Samuel turned to face her fully. "I was wrong," he said, his voice carrying as far as Clara's had. "Wrong to doubt you, wrong to let pride and fear stand where trust should have been. I do not stand here to bargain or to offer rescue. I stand to say I love you, Abigail Turner. I ask for your hand, not as charity, but as the partner I should have been from the start." The hall seemed to lean toward her, the air taut. Abigail rose, her gloves whispering against her skirts. "If I say yes, it is not to a life behind walls. It is to a life where the yards pay fair wages, where the children of those who work there learn to read their own futures, where no charity is given to shame." His answering nod was slow, deliberate, as though sealing a contract. "Then that is the life we will build." A stir ran through the chamber, a blend of surprise and something warmer. The alderman struck the table once more, not for silence, but in finality. The matter, it seemed, had been decided, not merely in law, but in the eyes of all who had gathered to watch. The harbour, which for months had lain under the grey fist of winter, was now touched by light that shimmered across the water like scattered silver. The air still carried a chill, but it was softened by the scent of damp earth and the promise of blossoms yet to open. Masts swayed gently against the pale blue sky, and gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp but almost jubilant. In the court of law, justice had spoken with a clarity that no whisper could undo. Silas Reed, his once impeccable composure stripped bare, was indicted for conspiracy and arson. The charges, read aloud in a room heavy with witnesses, left no doubt of his guilt. The ledger fragments, the dockhand's testimony, and the word of those who had long been silent formed a chain unbreakable by influence or coin. Reed was led away, his eyes darting for an ally and finding none. Ezra Pike was not there to watch it. By the time the indictment was read, he had already fled the city under threat of arrest, the shadows of his debts chasing him down the roads that led away from Boston. No one in the Whitlock household spoke his name again. The days that followed were unlike any Abigail had known since her arrival on Hanover Street. Contracts once withheld returned to the Whitlock yards as if the harbour itself had decided to turn its tide. Merchant after merchant, in tones both formal and cautious, acknowledged Samuel's integrity. And though some would never fully forget the scandal, there was no denying that the balance of power had shifted. Samuel did not waste the change. The reforms he had promised Abigail began to take root almost immediately. Hiring practices were altered, with every man, no matter his standing, to be paid a fair wage and given written terms. Injured workers were no longer discarded as burdens. One such man, the same whose arm had been broken in the rope walk sabotage, was promoted to overseer at full pay. his gratitude wordless but deep in its expression. The Harbour School, a notion born from Abigail's vision, began in a modest room above the chandlery. Abigail herself oversaw its beginnings, greeting children with the same warmth she had once reserved for the Whitlock Library, when Clara and Henry were her sole pupils. Fishermen's daughters and shipwrights' sons learned letters by the light of tall windows, their voices mingling with the scent of chalk and seawater. Mrs. Hill, when her duties allowed, sat at the back, her sharp eyes softened by pride. The Whitlock garden, neglected through years of grief, awakened under careful hands. Beds were turned, the soil enriched, and the first lilacs pushed their green buds into the warming air. It was here, among the tender shoots and the promise of colour, that Samuel and Abigail chose to wed. The ceremony was modest, yet each detail carried the weight of meaning. On the morning of the wedding, the house stirred earlier than usual. Mrs. Hill oversaw the placement of white linens on tables, the polishing of silver, and the arranging of lilac sprigs in small porcelain vases. The air within the house smelled of beeswax and blossoms, and sunlight fell through the tall windows in wide, warm shafts. Abigail, dressed in an ivory gown with a high lace collar, stood in her room before the looking-glass. Her veil, simple and sheer, was pinned carefully by Mrs. Hill, whose hands, steady as ever, lingered just a moment longer on her shoulder. "You came here as no one," she said, voice low but firm. "Today you walk out as yourself." In the garden, chairs had been placed in rows, facing an archway of lilacs and early roses. Temperance Winthrop was notably absent. Her seat remained empty, a silent emblem of battles won not by invitation but by choice. Clara and Henry stood together at the front, holding a small leather-bound book. They read the blessing they had prepared in unison, their voices clear and unshaken. They were no longer prisoners of silence. Samuel, in a dark frock coat and crisp white cravat, waited beneath the arch. When Abigail walked toward him, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes, his gaze never wavered. There was no audience in his eyes, only her. As they took each other's hands, there was a stillness in the garden, a pause that felt like the breath between tides. The vows were spoken plainly, without ornament, but they rang truer than any gilded speech. They spoke not of rescue, but of partnership, not of possession, but of choice. When they were pronounced man and wife, Samuel's hand remained firm around hers, the kind of grip that promised constancy through tempests yet unseen. That afternoon, word of their union spread through Boston's merchant circles. Some sent curt notes of congratulation, others formal letters edged in politeness but laced with curiosity. The Whitlock name, tarnished by scandal for too long, began to settle once more into a place of respect, if not yet affection, within society's ledger. 2 days later, the harbour gathered to witness the launch of a new vessel from the Whitlock yards. The ship, sleek and strong, bore a name painted in clean white letters across her hull, the Second Chance. The crowd lining the pier leaned forward as Abigail, her veil lifting slightly in the salt wind, stepped forward with Samuel at her side. She swung the bottle of champagne against the bow, the glass shattering in a spray of foam. Cheers broke out as the vessel slid into the water, the tide embracing her as if she had been meant for it all along. Samuel's hand rested over hers on the railing, warm and steady, as the ship found her place in the harbour. In that moment, Abigail felt the currents of her own life shift, no longer drifting at the mercy of others, but moving under her own sail, alongside a man who had learned the cost of pride and the strength in humility. As evening fell, the Whitlock mansion stood against the dusk, its tall windows aglow. From within, the sound of laughter floated into the night air. Warm lamplight spilled across the garden paths and onto the street beyond, a beacon not of wealth alone, but of a house that had opened its heart again. Once, it had been a place that held its breath, its corridors silent and its rooms heavy with loss. Now it breathed, a living home built not on bargains or rescues, but on truth, choice, and vows made between equals. The lilacs swayed gently in the night wind, their scent mingling with the salt of the sea, as if the earth itself approved of the life beginning within those walls. The harbour was no longer the same as it had been on that cold morning when Abigail first stepped onto Hanover Street. The masts still lined the horizon, but the city around them had swelled. Brick warehouses rose taller, the clamour of trade had grown louder, and the scent of salt and coal mingled with the aroma of bread from the new bakeries along the wharf. Yet for Abigail Whitlock, the greatest changes were not in the city's skyline, but in the life she had built within its tides. From the veranda of the Whitlock mansion, she watched two boys chasing each other along the garden path, their laughter spilling through the open windows. The elder, Samuel Jr., had his father's steady gait and quiet thoughtfulness, though his smile came more readily. The younger Thomas was quick to climb anything that would bear his weight, his hair a tumble of auburn curls that caught the sunlight, his mother's gift to him. Clara, now 18, walked between them with a book tucked beneath her arm, her patient voice coaxing them back to their studies. Henry, 16, taller than his sister and already showing a craftsman's hands, carried a small wooden model of a ship, explaining to his brothers the curvature of its hull. The house, once defined by silence, was now alive with movement and voices that had learned to speak without fear. Samuel stood beside Abigail at the railing, his hair touched with silver, the lines at his eyes deepened not by worry, but by years lived well. He still carried himself with the same quiet authority that had once commanded the shipyards, but his gaze softened when it rested on her. In the 8 years since their vows, the storms they had weathered together, some fierce, some subtle, had not worn them down, but shaped them into something stronger. The Whitlock yards had expanded, their reputation now tied not only to the quality of their ships, but to the fairness of their practices. Wages were paid promptly, injured workers were cared for, and the harbour school, now housed in a larger brick building, taught dozens of children each year. Some of those students had gone on to become shipwrights, merchants, and teachers in their own right. Not all had fared so well. Silas Reed had been convicted and spent his remaining years in prison, where his health withered under the weight of his own bitterness. Ezra Pike, though never caught, was last rumoured to have been seen in the ports of New Orleans, a shadow of the man who once swaggered through Boston's alleys. Temperance Winthrop's influence waned with the passing years. Her sharp tongue found fewer ears willing to listen, and her absence at society's gatherings was no longer remarked upon. Mrs. Hill, her hair now white as salt, still presided over the household with brisk efficiency, though she allowed herself moments of indulgence with the younger children. Her fondness for them was unfeigned, her watchfulness undiminished. Abigail sometimes thought of the day Samuel had bought her in front of the crowd, a memory that once carried the sting of humiliation. Now it lived in her mind as the first turn in a current that had carried them both into unfamiliar waters. Waters they had learned to navigate side by side. The strength between them was no longer in grand declarations, but in the thousand small ways they moved through life together. In the morning, walks through the garden, in the shared glances across a crowded room, in the quiet counsel offered when the world pressed too hard. That evening, as the sun lowered over the harbour, they gathered in the garden for the launch of a new ship. This one bore a name chosen by Clara and Henry together, the Harbour Light. As the vessel slid into the water, the cheers rose from workers, neighbours and friends. Abigail felt Samuel's hand close over hers, warm and steady, the same way it had been on the day they wed. 8 years had passed, and time had left its mark, but it had not dulled the truth they had built their lives upon. Love, when chosen freely and nurtured with respect, could outlast both scandal and storm. The Whitlock house, bathed in the golden light of dusk, stood as proof. From its tall windows, lamplight spilled once more onto the darkening street. It was no longer the guarded glow of a home holding its breath, but the open welcome of a place where the doors had been thrown wide, where voices mingled in warmth, and where the future, uncertain as any sea, was met together. Some stories remind us that the storms we face are not the end, but the beginning of a new course. Abigail and Samuel's journey showed that love is not built on rescue alone, but on trust, respect, and the courage to choose each other every single day. They proved that dignity can be reclaimed, that silence can be broken, and that even the coldest house can breathe again when truth is allowed to live within its walls. If you have followed this tale to its very last word, write the word harbor in the comments so I know you were here until the end. Your thoughts matter. Tell me what this story stirred in you, and let's keep this conversation alive. If you feel moved and wish to support the team that brings these romances to life, you can send us super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount you can or wish. Every contribution helps us create more stories for you. And if that's not possible right now, sharing this story with friends and family is another beautiful way to help it reach hearts that might need it. Don't miss the other love stories I've prepared for you. Some are just as dramatic, others even more intense. You'll find them in the cards on your screen now, because sometimes all it takes is one choice, one truth, and one shared journey to change everything.